I was born in 1931 and grew up out on Rockville Pike, just north of Georgetown Prep. And my father died when I was 7. He died of Rocky Mountain spotted tick fever. And we moved into Bethesda then and rented a house in Battery Park. And I walked down the road, down the old Georgetown Road, and went to Bethesda Elementary School. In 1940, my mother bought with my father's insurance money, I think, pretty sure. She bought a house on East-West Highway in the middle of Bethesda, a block from the high school and diagonally across the street from Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church. My mother lived there till she died. I went to public schools. Lynbrook was a new elementary, I went there. And then when the Catholic Church built their school, I went there. And then I went downtown and went to St. John's High School. And after that, I worked for a while, Veterans Administration, and then I went to Montgomery College, which in those days was called Montgomery Junior College. And when I finished that, I went to Maryland, and somewhere along the way, my wife and I decided to get married. This is not a smart thing to do when you're still in college, but we did it anyhow. Anyhow, I got a job teaching after I graduated at Leland Junior High School, which is the biggest school in the county, 2,000 kids. And it was a good job, and they were good people, good kids, which of course makes a good school. And then the draft came along, the Korean War draft, and my wife turned up pregnant just in time to keep me from being drafted. And so we got a son out of that, and then we've had 2 daughters since then. The streetcar came out here in the 1890s and ran until 1935, and that's certainly part of the reason it grew, was the streetcar. A number of suburbs popped up along the streetcar tracks all the way out Old Georgetown Road to Alta Vista. So the change in the law to civil service downtown was part of the story. There are lots of it. But it started small with a blacksmith and that kind of thing, and a tavern, and just kind of grew unplanned. There wasn't a plan until, I don't think till after World War II was there a master plan that included Bethesda. When I was a kid, there were 30,000 people lived here. Pretty good sized town, 30,000 people. We had everything a town needed. We had men's stores and women's stores, department stores, grocery stores, 10-cent stores. We had everything. Now, 10 times what it was during World War II. And the reason it grew is mainly where we are. It's a suburb. We feed the city. We do a lot less of that now than we did before, but that's how we got going. Let's start north on Rockville Pike. Rockville Pike, by the way, was a 3-lane road. Passing lane was in the middle. That made for some very big head-on crashes now and then. The Red Fox Tavern was big on that end of town, the north end. And there was an ice house and a couple of car dealers, including Chevy Chase Chevrolet, which is still in business, but doesn't sell Chevrolets anymore. And then in 1938, I believe it was, we got a nice Art Deco theater, the Bethesda Theater, which is a twin to the one the AFI has over in Silver Spring. And then there was Gifford's, a first-class ice cream candy store, and Pumphrey's Funeral Home that had been there for a long, long time. I don't even know how long. And a hot shop. The hot shop had just opened in 1940. That was brand new on the corner of East West and Wisconsin. There were lots of gas stations. We had one of every car dealer there was, except for Cadillac. On the west side of Wisconsin, there was a row of stores that Walter Tuckerman built, with a 3-story one in the middle, all the rest were 2, and a movie theater on the end, which was by 1940 called the Heiser. It had been the state before that. And then there was our nice new stone post office, our New Deal project. And next to it was the Madonna of the Trail, who got here in the late 20s. A fellow named Harry Truman from Missouri came and made the dedication speech. And across from that was our courthouse, a big red brick with pillars out front. Very nice building. They tore it down, of course, put up an ugly police station. And next to it was Dr. Perry's office building, probably the first office building in the county, 3 stories high. And then there was a couple of stores, including Carbert's, a first-class place to buy wedding presents and engagement rings and watches and that kind of thing. And one of our lumber yards, Eisinger's. We had, I think, 5 lumber yards in town when we got here in 1940. Then there was a railroad bridge. Now, the railroad came through town 4 or 5 times a day. Single track line went to Georgetown, brought in building supplies. Went in engine first, came out caboose first. There was one accident that I remember reading about. Going on down Wisconsin, there was a 10-cent store, Woolworths, and then a Sears, which became a department store called Palais Royal, I think. I don't remember. And then there's the Farm Women's Market, which is still there. It's been there since the early 30s. And then the first shopping center in Montgomery County, an L-shaped shopping center with a drugstore on one end and a paint store on the other. And then a whole row of stores built by the Warren brothers that are still there, south of Leland Street, with timber framed ceilings. And then the telephone company, a big gas station that was part of the Call Carl chain, and then one of the 3 sanitary stores that were in Bethesda. They ended up being called Safeway stores. I think all 3 of them still exist. The one down near St. John's Church is now Bray and Scarf. The one on Old Georgetown Road is a French restaurant. And the other one has been enveloped in some other sort of building, I don't remember. So there was lots of construction in Bethesda. Where East-West Highway met Wisconsin Avenue, in that row of stores that Walter Tuckerman built, there was a DGS grocery store. And that's where we did our grocery shopping. It was very nice, very friendly bunch of guys ran that store. And you could go in there with a quarter and get all the vegetables you needed to make soup. It was that kind of place. Heirloom was a dairy farm that was on Green Tree Road, and it eventually became the site of an elementary school. Some of its farm buildings are still there. There had been a number of farms, pretty big ones, but they were all gone by 1940. Now, you didn't want to go into Woodmont at night. If you were unknown, if you were not one of the boys, it was a tough neighborhood, and you could buy pretty much anything there, legal and illegal. There were a bunch of little stores. There were lots and lots of little, those lots were only 25 feet wide. It was a tough neighborhood, and the boys and girls that came from there mixed with the boys and girls from Chevy Chase at Leland Junior High School. It was very interesting to watch. Walter Tuckerman was a young banker who came out here just before the First World War and bought a derelict farm and turned it into Edgemoor, an upscale subdivision that brought more people, like Battery Park developed next to his development. He also built the first row of stores. He built the Bank of Bethesda and was the first president. He donated the land for the firehouse and for the Madonna's statue. He's number 1 when it comes to Bethesdans and being built. A fellow named George Sachs on the other end of town. There are lots of important women. There were 3 Perry brothers. T.W., who had the hardware, lumber, coal business at the lake. Dr. Benjamin Perry, was the #1 doctor in the area. He was also the political boss. He was E. Brooke Lee's man on this side of the creek. And his brother was Walter. And Walter ran a feed and grain store across from the Farm Women's Market. Walter had 2 very interesting wives. His first wife was one of the first women to be on the local school board, very active member of the League of Women Voters. And his second wife called herself Bill Perry. Her name was Willie Green Day, and she was a pistol. Boy, when in 1940, when we moved to Bethesda, the big fight going on was a charter fight to change the form of government. It had been going on for several years and would continue for several years, but they were all in the middle of it. Walter Perry said, men run all the businesses and women run everything else. And he was right. Just before the war was a terrific time. The town was booming and businesses were doing well, and the Chamber of Commerce and the Masons were well organized. Everybody was getting fat and happy. One of the things that we had was a high school. Now, high school is an institution in itself, and the principal, whose name was Tom Pyle, Thomas W. Pyle, he had been principal since the 20s and all through the 30s and into the war. And he made BCC into one of the best high schools in the state. And it was our pride and joy. It was something we bragged about with our high school. The war was tough on everybody. It's interesting, when you say the war to audiences these days, they say which war, but everybody knows the war. The war, which lasted 4 long years, impacted everything and everybody was involved, whether it's rationing, which we all suffered, or victory gardens, which we all grew. It was the most interesting time of the town's life, I'm sure. My great-grandfather came out here in 1860 and bought 100 acres in the middle of Bethesda. He owned everything from the post office south to Bradley Boulevard. And the northern part he gave to his daughter when she got married, and she married a guy named Miller, so it became Miller's Flats. But there was a small black community there because they were the guys that worked in the coal yards and the lumber yards and did all the menial work. They even had their own church there briefly, but the church moved with them down to River Road, and the church is still there, Macedonia Baptist Church. But it was a thriving community. And there was an elementary school there called River Road College School. In the summer of '45, when the war was over in Europe, but not in the Pacific, 2 brand new Navy fighters flew over Bethesda one Saturday, F-6Fs, Hellcats, bright blue, big radial engines. They flew north and then came back and buzzed the Navy hospital at flagpole height. They were down on the deck. And then they pulled up over the middle of town, one right behind the other, corkscrewing, rolling. And the second plane cut the first plane's tail off. Sounded like a trash truck crash. Ripped it right off, and the tail fluttered down to Battery Lane. The plane went inverted and the pilot fell out and pulled the ripcord, obviously, and his parachute dangled behind him and opened just before he landed in a tree across from the Bethesda Theater. The plane righted itself and came back toward the middle of the town. It's 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. The theaters are full of kids, the stores are full of women using up their ration points, and here came 2 tons of Navy fighter, full bore, and it crashed into the only vacant lot in the middle of town. The only one. Couldn't have crashed anyplace else and not caused damage. It simply made a big smoking hole in a muddy lot behind People's Drugstore and before a brick apartment building. And the The pilot walked down and looked at what had become of his plane, and I got my camera and ran up the street and took pictures. But that was a hell of an item, and nobody who saw it forgot it. I taught at Leland, and after I was there for 6 or 7 years, the county offered me a job as a writer-researcher up in Rockville. And so I went up there. It was a 2-year job, and I did it for 7 years and ended up writing the basic research piece on the junior high school that killed junior high schools. It was called Rite of Passage. And after that, I went and taught in high schools, Northwood, and then I ended up teaching at BCC. And the schedule got too tough and I was getting too old, so I quit and retired. When I retired, I had a whole pile of unused sick leave. And the county gave me about $10,000. Paid me for, I've forgotten what it was, a fraction of my sick leave. So I had this money. And I decided to write a history of Bethesda. And I figured I could just do that in a year. And 5 years later, after interviewing more than 200 people, I produced a history of Bethesda, and the sick leave money paid for it. The damn book made money. And so we published another bunch. They came in big boxes, 10 copies in the box, weighed 50 pounds. It's a big, thick book, 800 pages. We went into a 3rd edition on the book, and by then I was getting too old and tired and lazy to haul them out of the basement, so we quit. Besides, I think we'd probably sold all we were going to sell for a while. She's shaking her head no. It's still selling. You can buy it online. Last time I looked on eBay, there were some people asking $100 a copy for it. It ain't worth that. It's worth $30, that's all. Well, the best thing about writing the book was interviewing people. I started with firemen, old firemen, because they knew the town well. And they led me to doing milkmen who also knew the town, and to newspaper distributors and people like that. And they led me, one led to another, and I ended up, as I say, interviewing a couple of hundred people. It's hard to pick one out and say that's my favorite. I don't think I'd had a favorite. They were all interesting in different ways. Almost all of them let me record. There was one that didn't. And so I have a pile of taped interviews up in the attic. Teachers only get paid for 10 months. Unfortunately, I never could convince my family to stop eating for 2 months. So I had to get other jobs. And I did a lot of different things in the summertime. I sold used cars. I sold real estate. I worked in drugstores. I worked in, I think, every drugstore in Bethesda, and some that weren't even in Bethesda. When we got married and moved over to College Park for a year, I worked at a drugstore because that's the business I knew. So that was all that. And I coached at Our Lady of Lourdes for, what, 30 years? About 30 years. All sports. I've lived here since the 1940s. My wife has lived in Chevy Chase since she was born. And this is home. And it's a good place to be home.